Good morning. Welcome to the Surface Transportation Board's hearing on rail capacity and infrastructure, and welcome also to the STB's new headquarters here at 395 E Street Southwest. The STB is honored today to have approximately 31 witnesses scheduled to present statements and respond to questions on one of our nation's most important economic and quality of life challenges. How can we meet the growing demand for efficient and reasonably priced rail transportation of freight and passengers? One of my priorities as chairman of the STB is to ensure that this agency has the information, expertise, and wisdom to play a meaningful role in ensuring that our nation meets these challenges. I'll keep my opening remarks brief so we can begin to listen, learn from, and question our witnesses who bring expertise from the front lines in the battle against transportation system congestion and gridlock. It's my hope that this hearing will shed light on the full nature and scope of the growing rail transportation capacity challenge that we all are confronted with. As we'll hear from experts today, freight and passenger rail traffic is forecast to grow faster than planned infrastructure and capacity expansion investment. Transportation alternatives via modes such as highways or aviation are also saddled with congestion. Transportation planners are counting on the rail sector to at least maintain its percentage share of the transportation load, a goal that will require enormous leadership, creativity, and investment. It's also my hope that this hearing will serve as a reminder that the various and diverse stakeholders in the rail sector, many of whom are with us today, welcome, including large and small shippers from different industries, large and small freight and passenger railroads, local, state, and federal governmental entities, seaport managers, highway users who benefit from the congestion relief that railroads provide to the highways, rank-and-file consumers who benefit from unprecedented choice, value, and availability of goods thanks to rail, and all stakeholders, all of the railroad stakeholders. We all have much more in common when confronted by the rail capacity challenge than we might be accustomed to believing. Stakeholders who may bring many decades of contentious disagreement on various rail service, rate, and regulatory issues may well decide that in view of the challenge before us, it is in everyone's interest to work cooperatively to address the rail capacity challenge before it reaches crisis proportions. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today on a number of key issues that relate to rail capacity, including how do we attract and incentivize significant increased levels of private investment in rail capacity? How do we guarantee continued rail service in an effective manner and at reasonable rates in the face of severe capacity constraints? And a related question, how can the common carrier obligation be safeguarded? What is the federal government's role in addressing these challenges? And what policy, statutory, and regulatory changes are needed to address these challenges? And there'll be more questions, I'm sure. Before turning to my board colleagues for their opening statements, I have a few administrative and housekeeping matters to mention. As you can see from the witness list, we have quite a long hearing in store for you today. In an effort to keep the testimony moving along, we will have no breaks longer today than 15 minutes, and I intend to keep even those breaks to a minimum. That means, of course, that there will not be a formal lunch break. Regarding the testimony itself, as usual, we will hear from all the speakers on the panel prior to questions from the commissioners. Speakers, please note that the timing lights are in front of me right here on the front dais, and you'll see a yellow light when you have 1 minute remaining and a red light when your time has expired. Please do your best to keep on the time to the time you've been allotted. After hearing from the entire panel, we will rotate with questions from each board member until we've exhausted the questions. Additionally, just a reminder to please turn off your cell phones. Finally, for witnesses especially, please note that these mics are extremely sensitive, and they are in the on position as long as you see the red light illuminated. And the only way to dim the red light is to press firmly down on the button that's marked push. I just point that out because they are extremely lively, and we have an audience around the world tuning in via the internet. This is being a webcast. And lastly, I'd like to briefly acknowledge and thank the STB staff who worked on preparing this hearing. I would also like to thank the building security team for their assistance today. This is the first hearing, as I mentioned, and we've all been tested in trying to figure out how the new accommodations will work best. By the way, we welcome comments as you come and go. Just grab a STB staffer if you've got any ideas for how we can make these hearings and coming and going from them and to them operate more smoothly. I'd also like to thank the STB staff who worked tirelessly along with our colleagues at the General Services Administration to ensure that our STB headquarters relocation went smoothly. And now it's my honor to turn to Vice Chairman Buttry for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to add my welcome to all of our guests today. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. I'm really looking forward to hearing the testimony. This mic is really sensitive, isn't it? Looking forward to the testimony today, and especially our administration witness who's here with us this morning. I ride the train every day, basically every day. So I have a keen awareness for the railroad and appreciation for the railroad and the service they provide. That wasn't true a few weeks ago, but I ride the train basically every day today into work. So I'm keenly aware of those issues. I was standing down on the platform the other night on my way home, thinking of what pithy I might have to say today at these hearings, and I happened to look down at the roadway in front of me, and peering up from me from the ballast was this: a rail spike, just looking right up at me, right in front of me. Now, for those of you in the back of the room, you probably can't see this rail spike, but for those of you who are in the front, you can. This rail spike is not in very good shape. It was not in the tie; it was laying on the side of the railroad, and I've seen these before. But this one was more important to me than the others I've seen, because it sort of seemed to me to symbolize the condition not only of some of the rail infrastructure that we have and the need to improve it, but all of the infrastructure in the country basically is in need of dire repair and maintenance and replacement. And it's a huge public policy issue that needs addressing, and it's simply not being addressed. And it doesn't seem to me that there's enough money in the world to put it back where it needs to be, where it should be, and certainly not enough public money to do so. So there seems to me to be a huge need for new thinking, new innovative ways of doing things, and new approaches to this issue if it's ever going to be solved, because there's just not enough money to do what needs to be done out there, and it's certainly not going to be generated, from where I sit anyway, by the revenues that are being gained by the railroads. And so there's going to have to be some really new thinking and innovative approaches, maybe even revolutionary approaches to this issue, or are we going to end up with the whole system looking like this rail spike right here? Now I'm going to lay this right up here on the so everybody can see it during the hearing, and I'm going to keep it on my desk to remind me of the issue as well, because I think it's extremely important. It's something we all need to be stepping out and getting out in front of these issues before they overcome us. Now, the American Society of Professional Civil Engineers produces every 2 or 3 years a report card, if you will, on the state of our infrastructure in this country. And they not recently, actually it was the 2006, came out with the infrastructure figures, or the infrastructure grade report card like you got in grade school on the infrastructure. And here's what they had to say: aviation D+, bridges C, dams D, drinking water D-, energy power grid D, hazardous waste D, navigable waterways D-, public parks and recreation C-, rail C-, roads D, schools D, solid waste C+, transit D+, wastewater D-. That's what the civil engineering community had to say about it. Every time you look at numbers about infrastructure in this country, it doesn't make any difference what aspect of infrastructure you're talking about. The numbers are dismal. They're frightening. They're scary. And it just indicates the void that there is that we have right now in terms of new innovative ways of thinking about things. Now, it just so happens that yesterday Commissioner Mulvey and I were spent most of the day really at at a global infrastructure conference here in town and heard about some exciting new things that are being done with sort of an old, I think sort of an old term, the public-private partnership concept, P3, PQ, whatever you want to call it. And there's a lot of interesting things going on in that area. And it's going to take an attraction of huge amounts of private funds, of private money to make this happen. I don't see any other way for it to happen. I am very excited about this hearing today. I'm anxious to hear what you have to say, and I hope at some point along the way, either today or in the very near future, somebody steps forward and takes the lead on getting this issue off the dime, getting it off square one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Buttrey. Now we'll turn to Commissioner Mulvey for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Nottingham. Good morning, and welcome to our panelists and other attendees to our first Sunrise hearing. I'm glad that we have such a robust turnout for our inaugural hearing in this our new building. I want to associate myself also with the recent remarks of Vice Chairman Buttrey. The hearing yesterday with Deloitte Touche sponsor was very interesting, although they did focus on the need to get private investment in public infrastructure. But there is the flip side of that coin, which perhaps is more relevant to this group, because here the infrastructure is privately owned, and the question is how we get public investment in the private infrastructure, or public support for private infrastructure. The number and diversity of interests represented here today is a testament to the critical nature of the rail capacity crunch that's currently facing our nation. I have given speeches to various stakeholders around the country and have spoken out about this looming problem, how we got to this point, and what we might do to solve it. And I'm very pleased that we have initiated this hearing to further explore the extent of the capacity constraints, potential solutions to expand capacity, the infrastructure investment needed to maintain the world's leading freight rail system, and learn about innovative financing techniques to spur on this investment. Most of the written testimony submitted in this docket focuses on the physical rail assets and in-the-ground infrastructure. But as we all know, railroads cannot operate without a strong and well-prepared labor force. I am mindful of this human capital aspect as well, and I want to thank rail labor for their written comments in this regard. As an economist, I understand how railroads allocate scarce resource amongst competing investment opportunities. And as an environmentalist, I understand the benefit that increased rail capacity can have on our nation's air quality by taking trucks off our highways. As a public service, I recognize the difficult to quantify and indirect advantages to so many parties that we can secure by harmonizing our transportation networks. And as an academic and a former Hill staff director, I understand the obstacles to harnessing the leadership and generating the momentum for change. We are all looking for answers to the capacity conundrum. The answers that make the most sense, are the most efficient, and hopefully are the simplest to implement. I hope that today's hearing leads us towards these answers. And as always, I am eager to hear today's testimony and to engage in dialogue with our witnesses. Thank you very much, Chairman Nottingham.
Thank you, Commissioner Mulvey. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first panel. We are very fortunate as a country to have an Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Transportation named Jeff Shane. We're very honored today to have Undersecretary Shane with us. I had the privilege of working directly with and for Secretary Shane at the department for over 4 years, and he's joined today, I'm pleased to see, by Tony First, who is one of the preeminent career experts on freight forecasting and related issues and data. Without further ado, Secretary Shane, I'll just note that you've had more tours at DOT than anyone I can think of. It's your proverbial master sergeant of the Army with your tours. Some of them may remind you of combat occasionally, but I assure you today will not. Without further ado, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I think the term my colleagues usually refer to me as is bad penny, not master sergeant. I keep turning up. Chairman Nottingham, Vice Chairman Buttrey, and Commissioner Mulvey, it's really a very special privilege today to represent Secretary of Transportation Mary Peters to discuss rail traffic forecasts, rail capacity constraints, and of course the infrastructure investment needed to maintain reliable and efficient freight service. I am very pleased to be accompanied today by Tony First, the Director of Federal Highway Administration's Office of Freight Management and Operations. While Tony is in the Federal Highway Administration, he is not a highway guy, he is a freight guy. He is a system performance guy, and the fact that he is here is, I think, a tribute to the department's evolution toward a far more intermodal and comprehensive focus on our transportation system. It's also a very special privilege, I will note, to be the first witness at the first hearing in the board's new facility. We welcome you to Sybaritic, Southwest Washington, D.C. We're sorry that we're not going to be your neighbors for very much longer because, as you know, we are moving even further east, but we'll welcome you to lunch there as soon as we're set up. So I look forward to that. All of us agree that the Staggers Act has been profoundly successful in restoring the railroad industry to financial health. Now we face the challenges of success. Surging demand for freight transportation, reflecting our growing economy, strains the existing infrastructure. We need to go on to meet the challenges that this industry faces in a new century. The physical rail network since 1990 has not expanded. Indeed, it has decreased by almost 20%, while revenue ton miles increased by 64%. As a result, system average train speed had fallen by 2005 to the lowest level in 16 years. While there appears to have been some recovery in 2006, it's clear that we are finally running enough freight trains to consume the capacity of the network, in the words of Rob Ritchie, the CEO of Canadian Pacific. System congestion adds extra cost to virtually all goods and services produced in the economy. We estimate that, taken together, these overall costs of congestion add up to nearly $200 billion a year, and billions of dollars of this reflects the cost of congestion on the nation's rail network. Since the Staggers Act, even though the physical system was shrinking, record productivity gains allowed railroads to carry much more traffic. The growth in demand will mean that the needs of shippers can no longer be met solely by growing productivity. The Federal Highway Administration forecasts that overall demand for freight transportation will grow 43% by the year 2020, and demand for rail transportation will grow by at least 35%, possibly more. This growth in demand means that events that once would have had little effect now cause major disruptions throughout the rail network because there is no reserve capacity. West Coast storms in 2005, for example, interrupted shipments from California ports to the east and forced eastern carriers to hold traffic moving west, causing filled yards and a clogged rail system. In the Powder River Basin, necessary track work and severe winter weather slowed delivery of coal to utilities. Railroads are increasing their capital expenditures to build new capacity. The railroads invested nearly $100 billion in capital expenditures between 1990 and 2006, and 15 to 20% of that investment was for capacity expansion. The railroads are investing in double and triple tracking strategic lines, improving yards, and adding new locomotives and rolling stock. Railroad capital expenditures hit a new record last year of over $8 billion, over 15% of operating revenues. Investments in new technology can also increase rail freight capacity. Positive train control can reduce headways and improve train speeds and safety, allowing for more efficient train movements. Electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, so-called ECP brakes, can vastly improve train control, improve network capacity, save fuel and equipment maintenance, and enhance safety. Neither of these technological breakthroughs, however, is cheap. Each system requires substantial investment on the part of the railroads. The industry's capital expense budget, while large, is not unlimited. Railroads must be confident that any given investment will be justified by traffic levels or cost-saving operational improvements. These investments are unlikely to meet surge demands, and there is some question whether the industry can keep up with even normal demands, given the growing levels of traffic. The rail industry has been clear that it is committed to expanding capacity at a pace justified by available capital and project-by-project rates of returns. But that investment may not be enough to respond to nationwide capacity and congestion issues. The 2003 AASHTO Freight Rail Bottom Line Report estimated that the rail system would need to invest between $9 and $10 billion a year to maintain current traffic and accommodate a fair share of forecast growth. Of that, the rail industry could be expected to cover $6 to $7 billion. The remainder would have to come from other sources. Public-private partnerships provide one approach to meeting these demands. Some federal loan programs are available to help fund rail projects. The RIF and TIFIA programs provide loans and loan guarantees but have limited funding. Some rail-oriented projects, including CREATE, were funded under the new Projects of National and Regional Significance program, part of SAFE-T-LU, our current surface transportation authorization legislation. The Private Activity Bond Authority that appears in SAFE-T-LU authorizes tax-exempt borrowing for intermodal terminals, and Section 130 funds can be used to improve the safety of rail highway grade crossings. A number of states also have programs to provide the public share of public-private rail projects. Needless to say, this mix of programs will not allow all worthwhile programs to be funded. Projects like CREATE, the Houston Rail Rationalization Project, and the Mid-Atlantic MAROPS project have not yet received sufficient funding to move forward. One approach for rail could be the development of third-party projects where non-railroad private sector interests build and operate specific pieces of infrastructure, funding it through tolls or other user fees. This approach is being explored in the Trans-Texas Corridor, a partnership of Sintra of Spain and Zachry from San Antonio to build a 600-mile corridor, including both a toll road and a high-speed freight rail line. The $6 billion cost would be financed primarily through charges to shippers. BNSF, UP, and CSX are also using the department's new Private Activity Bond Authority to finance 2 intermodal rail transfer facilities in Illinois, developed by 2 real estate investment trusts, Ridge Property Trust and Centerpoint. These projects demonstrate that third-party investors are prepared to fund rail projects as well as highway projects. The rail economic regulatory framework must ensure that needed capacity investments are not discouraged. Already, high levels of demand from shippers for rail services are exacerbating tensions between carriers and shippers, with some calling for more constraints on rail rates and revenues. Since 1980, the Surface Transportation Board has administered the Staggers Act carefully to ensure a favorable climate for rail infrastructure investment. It is important that the regulatory framework continue to contribute to solving capacity problems rather than compounding them. The board is rightly focused on crafting a regulatory environment that balances the needs of the railroads for enough revenues to support investment in capacity with the needs of customers for protection from excessive rates that can arise when shippers are captive. The board has maintained this regulatory balance while streamlining its procedures for deciding both large and small railroad rate cases to reduce litigation costs, to create incentives for private investment, private settlement of disputes, and shorten the time required to develop and present these cases. The board's section on environmental analysis has also led the way in addressing community and environmental issues associated with rail capacity expansion, for providing thorough analyses of these environmental issues in connection with applications for mergers and construction of new rail lines. The high level of rail operations has led to numerous complaints about noise, blocked grade crossings, and reduced safety. Major capacity expansion may be delayed if community issues of this sort are not addressed upfront and addressed effectively. As third-party private sector finance becomes a more significant aspect of investment in rail capacity, it's important that the board encourage this development and not allow its procedures to become an obstacle to this new form of investment. Demand for rail transportation is growing faster than additional capacity can be provided, leading to service problems as traffic increases. State and local public-private partnerships are a well-tested mechanism for funding rail projects within significant public benefits, but the public sector, like the rail industry, has limited available funds. We need to add other models, such as third-party investments, where appropriate. Finally, the federal government needs to be wary of actions that would skew the market. We should not support mechanisms that foster speculative projects based on wishful thinking, nor should we discourage needed investment or encourage disinvestment through an unbalanced regulatory policy. Mr. Chairman, I will stop there. That's a summary of my longer remarks. I hope those longer remarks will be made part of the record of this proceeding, and I thank you again for the opportunity to testify here this morning.
Thank you, Secretary Shannon. You can be assured your entire remarks will be included in the record. And I should note that the record will remain open for an additional 30 days for anyone who has additional information to submit. Secretary Shane, did you ever think when you first came to the department that you'd be talking someday about a shortage of rail capacity in an environment where all of the Class 1 railroads are doing pretty well financially?
You know, I came to the department so long ago that I'm not even sure any longer what I thought at that time. It is, in many ways, it's a thrill to have the problem that we have today. I listened carefully to what the Vice Chairman was talking about in terms of the grades which the ASCE had given infrastructure throughout our economy, and I think of the classic metaphor of the glass half full and the glass half empty. All of these grades are a tribute to a very robust economy that's outstripping the infrastructure that we have. The United States, let's make no mistake, led the way in the creation of transportation infrastructure. We showed the rest of the world how to do it. The rest of the world had the advantage of being able to leapfrog us to some extent by taking advantage of new techniques and new technologies that weren't available when we were building our infrastructure. And so we now feel like we're in a catch-up mode. But let's not kid ourselves. I mean, the United States continues to be a world leader in transportation. I fully expect that we have the ingenuity and the creativity to respond to the challenges that we now have. We have no option but to respond to those challenges. The transportation demands, the demands being put on our system in all of its sectors are nothing less than a tribute to a robust economy, and we should be proud of that and recognize that we have a lot of work to do. And rather than say, woe is me, woe is us, we should simply get on to the business of finding the tools necessary to ensure that we have the capacity, we have the efficiency necessary to support this robust economy going forward.
You've had a extensive career internationally as well, and are the department's lead and leader in the international arena. I've had the privilege of working with you a little bit on some of the international issues we wrestle with at the Federal Highway Administration. How do you assess the condition and state of the U.S. freight rail network and system when compared to our competitors overseas? And do you see any models or any trends internationally that we should be mindful of?
Well, it's an interesting question. For all the hand-wringing about rail capacity shortages in the United States, when you go overseas, people simply marvel at the efficiency and productivity of the U.S. freight rail system. It's one of the wonders of the world, they think. They're emulating us in Europe, trying to figure out how to achieve some of the gains that we've achieved over time. Very clearly, the Staggers Act was profound, one of the most profound economic policy decisions in the nation's history. And it has engendered the kinds of efficiencies and productivity that have really encouraged the demand, I suppose, in many ways that we are complaining about today. I think that we have nothing to be anything but proud of in terms of where we stand in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is looking at our freight rail system with a sense of admiration and wonder.
Turning to the passenger rail side, we are reminded often that there is statutory language giving a certain level of priority to passenger rail service, particularly for Amtrak. Gives the department some very important secretaries and very important authorities to intervene in that area where appropriate. Do you see that? How's that working at the department? Do you see that as an area that's ripe for change or discussion? We hear about it sometimes here at the STB. I've often wondered why we don't see more either complaints raised. I'll have certainly questions later for folks involved with the passenger rail sector, but talk to me about what's going on in that area. Where do you see the federal role in passenger rail going?
Well, in the 1971, of course, we created the National Passenger Rail Corporation from the carcasses of a variety of other previous passenger rail operations. The intention was to create a for-profit company that would provide efficient passenger rail service for the country in the corridors that needed it. That model very clearly has not worked very well. It is seriously in need of reform. This administration has proposed ways of reforming the system, which we feel are the best ideas for the system in the last 30 years. Frankly, they haven't gotten sufficient traction on Capitol Hill, such that we aren't seeing very much movement in the direction of reform, except to some extent if you look at what Amtrak itself is doing. I think we have now a board and management that are taking the needs for improvement very seriously, not just improvement in terms of the framework that currently exists, but perhaps even a willingness to move toward a more effective framework. The interface, obviously, between passenger rail and freight rail is problematic. And it's my view, and it has been my view for a long time, that if we could finally overcome the resistance to fundamental reform in the way we do our passenger rail service, we might very well become, it may be possible to overcome the need to have all of our passenger rail riding on freight tracks and the kinds of conflicts that necessarily arise from the intersection of those two modes of transportation. I think it's going to be a while, however, before we see the kind of reform that will be necessary to take the passenger rail system and put it on the same footing as the rest of our federally funded transportation network, where we have a partnership between the federal government and the states for the purpose of ensuring that there is infrastructure there and that infrastructure is maintained. We should care less what rides on top of the infrastructure. We haven't relied on any federal funding of the providers of transportation. We have essentially relied on federal and state funding of infrastructure in the rest of our system, and it's our hope that we will eventually move toward that model for purpose of passenger rail as well, and perhaps begin to see some greater efficiencies there, and less conflict perhaps between passenger and freight rail.
You've been a leader in the transportation data area and a champion for more resources and focus on that. And I do share your concern that we need more attention to the data when we travel and speak with port administrators, and we'll hear from at least one or two today, and other folks who are on the front lines of the international trade situation, and you talk to folks at the ports about their forecast for freight coming in, much of it dependent on the rail network to bring it into the country and into the markets. Often there's discomfort with recognizing the data because it requires sometimes uncomfortable action and uncomfortable discussions about investments, about land use planning, about community impacts, about environmental mitigation. Do you have any advice on how we can elevate the dialogue and the focus on good data, to help make sure it's ready and available and before decision makers at all levels, and also so we can avoid any convenient sort of ignorance of what the data is really telling us about freight forecasts, traffic forecasts?
It's a great question. I've been surprised at the struggle we've had within the Department of Transportation to get basic funding for the most essential forms of data, without which, of course, we're just flying blind. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics was created under Ice-T, as you know, and I would say in all candor that it's been a work in progress ever since that time. It has not, I think, in the minds of many in the transportation community, delivered the quality or the kind of data that we need in order to form conclusions that inform policy going forward. I'm happy to say that the creation of the Research and Innovative Technology Administration within DOT a couple of years ago, and moving the Bureau of Transportation Statistics into that new administration, really one of the most important developments in the history of the Department of Transportation, has begun to improve things considerably. There is a new director of the Bureau of Transportation Statistics as of a few weeks ago, Steve Dillingham. We are putting a lot of attention on the importance and the quality of that data, and I'm hopeful that with funding for the commodity flow survey pretty well established and other important programs getting the funding that they need, that we will see a dramatic improvement in the quality of that information, and by the same token, a dramatic improvement in the quality of analysis that we're able to do based on that data.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Buttry, questions?
I'd just like to say again how much we appreciate you coming and sharing your views with us today, but I have no questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Mulvey?
Thank you. The freight rail demand forecasts really can't be realized unless we invest in our capacity and our infrastructure. And has the department made any attempt to quantify what the cost to our nation's output and employment might be if we don't make these investments? I mean, have you looked at various scenarios that if our investment falls this much short or that much short, what that will mean for future growth of GDP and employment?
I don't know that we've correlated shortfalls in investment in that way. What we have looked at is the overall cost of congestion. I guess
Right.
it's a somewhat rougher measure, you might say, of the same phenomenon. We've seen measures of the cost of congestion from the Texas Transportation Institute, for example. We actually think they're understated. We think that those are measures of things that can be easily quantified, the time and traffic, the amount of fuel being wasted, and so forth. We think when you use a kind of multiplier effect approach and look at the economy at large, you come up with a number associated with congestion of something like $200 billion a year. That's a very large number for any economy, and it ought to concentrate minds wonderfully about the importance of really ramping up our investment in transportation.
Clearly, the TTI numbers focus on urban transportation and urban congestion and highway congestion,
Right.
but it doesn't really take into account the overall economic activity impacts of congestion. And if we can't handle all those containers coming in from Los Angeles, et cetera, they're going to go elsewhere, and that's going to have an impact on our overall economy because it also could mean production will also go elsewhere, and the effects could reverberate throughout the system. You mentioned some of the programs the department has to invest in capacity. You mentioned the RIF program. The RIF program has now been expanded to $35 billion, but it's my understanding that not all of that $35 billion has been made available. Approximately how much has been made available of the RIF program in the more than a decade it's been around?
How much has actually been loaned or
out,
guaranteed through the RIF program? I don't have the exact number. It's in the billions, I believe, but I will have to supply that for the record, Commissioner.
I was out of Chicago last week talking about the CREATE project, and the CREATE project, I think many other people think, is probably the most important rail project in the country today, because solving the bottleneck problems in Chicago would be critical for the entire national system. The Safety Lou bill, the department put up $100 million towards that CREATE project, but the project was looking for more like $500 million from the federal government. Do you think in the subsequent legislation the department will be more supportive of increasing the funding for CREATE? And what should the Chicago and Illinois do and the railroads do to try to ensure that the federal government comes up with people have identified as, quote unquote, its share of the CREATE project?
Well, I remember being a little disappointed with that $100 million number as well. We expected the number to be a larger one than that, and I don't recall that the administration put any pressure on Congress to reduce the number, at least not in my recollection. I think we really do need to focus on CREATE. CREATE is one of the most important, as you say, Commissioner Mulvey, most important facilitators, I think, of a more efficient national freight rail work that we can possibly focus on. I do think we have to be creative, again, as I said in my testimony, looking for new tools for the financing of these projects. There are ways of developing revenue streams to support infrastructure in all modes of transportation that we have not sufficiently exploited in the past. I think it is not the case that we have relied heavily on a federal-centric model for rail infrastructure. On the other hand, there is in the minds of, I think, most citizens the notion that the federal government represents some pot of gold that will always be available to support transportation infrastructure when it's needed. That's an assumption that we're going to have to re-examine. There will always be a stream of investment coming from the federal government, coming from state governments, but we are going to have to recognize where there is also private capital available in ways that haven't been exploited before, and begin to tap into sources of investment that we haven't seen. It is necessary to provide a rate of return on that capital to encourage that investment, however, and so we are being creative. It's necessary to be creative now in terms of how we organize and structure these projects such that investors do see utility in investing in them, and at the same time getting away from the notion that it's all free. It's not going to be free. There's going to have to be a cost associated with everything. It'll be a smaller cost, however, than the cost of doing nothing, as this board knows so well.
You have testified that the investment risk for railroads is much greater than that for highways because of the more limited pool of users from which the railroad may recover the cost of its investment. Would that suggest to you that the federal government ought to be more or less inclined to help fund railroad capacity investment than it funds for the highway capital investment, given the public interest in trying to move freights off the highways and onto rail? So just the railroads can't expect to get it back from a restricted pool of users. Should the federal government, as a matter of policy, be doing more?
Well, let me just say, as a general proposition, I think you'll find that different administrations are going to be more or less inclined. I think it's not a function of inclination. I think it's a function of reality. The entitlements sector of the federal budget is simply overwhelming the discretionary side. It's a fact of life. Every administration going forward is going to be looking for ways to reduce, not expand, public sector investments of this sort. So I think it's really important that all of us simply try to get over the fantasy that there's going to be a huge influx of public sector investment, particularly from the federal government, into rail infrastructure in the future. It is not going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen regardless of the political party or the philosophy of the administration that's in charge of the executive branch or the Congress, frankly. These are just facts of life that it's time to acknowledge and to use as a basis for moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wolf. I just have one or two questions, and every once in a while a question will come up where one finds oneself, having been an eyewitness to something that I need to plunge in. And on the discussion of Safety Lou and the CRATE project, that was an excellent question, Commissioner Mulvey, and certainly I agree. And I've had the opportunity to walk some of the track in the project with Commissioner Mulvey, and his concern and his role as a champion for that project, the CRATE project in Chicago, is commendable. It is certainly a extremely important project of national significance, probably unparalleled in the rail sector. My recollection of working on the Safety Lou bill for 3+ years at the department is that we made a conscious decision that to earmark a specific project would only invite more earmarks and probably a dilution of the actual funding put onto truly major and incredibly important projects. And instead we created programs and policy proposals that would emphasize freight corridor investments with the CRATE project very much in mind. And sadly what we saw was, of course, an explosion of earmarks and kind of a, nobody could get more, all projects are equal, and the CRATE project ended up with something like $100 million. And I would just caution the folks in the rail sector who may be less familiar with the day-to-day workings of the Highway and Transit Authorization Bill that that is a precedent to be watchful for and not to model one's sort of strategy on, because if federal investment gets distorted into a series of earmarks for every state and county and precinct in the country, we won't see the right level of investment for the truly important projects such as CRATE. So just a word of caution as we talk about federal investment as to what that can lead to. I'm not opposed to it by any means, but just a word of caution there. Any comments in that regard?
No, you're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. I think you and I lamented at the time the quality of the debate over Safety Lou. Rather than talking about the programmatic innovations which the administration sent to Congress, proposed to Congress, we ended up in a long debate about what the level of funding would be, and of course the number of earmarks that would be in the bill. And in my response to Commissioner Mulvey, what I said was we did not focus on the level of funding for CREATE. We were against earmarks generally, but that was because we felt that if earmarks could be pushed out, there'd be far more discretionary funding available for projects of genuine national significance. That's what we didn't get. What we got was 6,000 plus earmarks, and it was a huge disappointment to all of us. I think even the Congress, in fairness, has reacted to its own performance in that, and we've seen a number of rule changes that hopefully will diminish the focus on earmarking and hopefully increase the focus on policy innovation as we move forward.
Thank you. Just the last question, but it's an important one. and you touched on this already, Secretary Shane, but I need to ask the question. I'll be asking this of a number of witnesses today. What one thing, more than anything else, can we do, either here at the STB or on the national policy level, to attract, to incentivize increased private investment in the rail sector?
Well, I think by ensuring that the rail sector is able to maintain profitability, that they have the wherewithal to actually plan and develop projects that have a predictable chance of generating the revenues necessary to provide the return that investors are looking for, you're doing as much as you possibly can. As I said in my testimony, I think the board has tried to manage that issue very carefully. We do understand that there are some shippers who do not have sufficient competition available to them, and there's a problem there, and that has to be managed carefully as well. On the other hand, I think the board has resisted the suggestion that a return somehow to rate regulation is going to somehow be the right way to go. If you do that, and I don't suggest that anybody's seriously thinking about it, but if you did, you would see investment in this industry dry up overnight. That's the most important message I think the department wants to send, which is let's not run away from the success of the Staggers Act. It was the most, as I say, deregulation, I think, is the most profound economic policy decision that we've ever made in this country. In transportation, we deregulated back in the late 70s and early 80s, and of course it spawned deregulation of a whole host of other sectors, financial services, telecommunications, energy, and so forth, and has become increasingly the default policy around the world. When I say that the United States continues to be a leader, it's a leader in that way too. It's invented here and followed elsewhere. And I don't mean that to be chauvinistic, it's just a fact of life. And we can be proud of that. It's important that we maintain that innovative spirit and that we not move backwards from the kinds of policies that have led to the economic success that we're enjoying today.
Thank you, Secretary Shane. Any additional questions from commissioners?
I have one. We're just talking about getting more investment in the railroad infrastructure from, say, third-party investors. And in your testimony, you say that it would be good for the board to encourage these developments and not allow its procedures to become an obstacle to this form of investment. And I couldn't agree more. But right now we are dealing with this whole issue of preemption. Then the board preempts state and local regulations with respect to controls over yards and terminals, et cetera. And there is some concern about that. And of course, if the board steps in and regulates those, which we don't right now, we regulate the lines as opposed to the yards themselves, it's feel that there's a gap in this part of our regulatory system. And others say, well, the board should give up preemption of these yards and terminals and turn it back over to the states. Do you have any opinion on what the board's role should be in this, what we can do from a positive aspect to encourage third-party investment, and how we might avoid making the problem worse by changing our rules on preemption?
I actually don't have a very firm view of that. I'd really be interested in hearing what rail industry witnesses have to say about that. It seems to me an important question. I think if preemption is likely to create more efficiency and predictability in terms of standards that are essentially harmonized throughout the country, that sounds to me like an appropriate objective. On the other hand, I'm not sure exactly what the states are proposing that's being preempted, and what public policy rationale would be offered for that. So I don't have very much wisdom to offer the board on that question, I'm afraid.
I'll take the advantage of that and ask one more question. When the subject of Amtrak came up, and Amtrak is something which I have some long familiarity with. I think those who founded Amtrak will probably regret to their dying days, those of us who are still left, who are involved in the early days of Amtrak, the inclusion of the old for-profit clause in the creation of Amtrak. Those around, I don't think, ever seriously thought that Amtrak would be a for-profit or would ever make money, but rather that the for-profit idea was largely done to ensure that Amtrak employees would not be civil servants. But Amtrak has always operated at a loss, and today there's growing demand for rail passenger services. There's also a growing demand for commuter rail services. At the same time, the freight system upon which these things run is at capacity. Is there any possibility for marrying commuter rail and Amtrak intercity rail needs with freight rail investments so we can get the benefit of the a large public support for these investments, while simultaneously meeting the needs for economic support for investment in rail.
I think that possibility clearly exists. I mean, again, it's going to be a function of whether Congress is prepared to re-examine the current framework and either stay slavishly shackled to it, or be willing to take a look at different models, as indeed the administration a few years ago asked Congress to do. Thus far, the debate seems to be about what level we're going to fund Amtrak at. It's just it's a recurrent dialogue that we have with Congress, and it's only about one thing, and that is a number. We aren't seeing sufficient attention to the need to reform the structure such that you would be able to get some of the energy and the efficiency of some of our better commuter operations linked to Amtrak in a way that produced not only a more efficient commuter rail transportation, but better intercity rail transportation as well. We think the possibilities are exciting for rail transportation for passengers. It's just that as long as we're stuck in this broken model that, as you say, we made the mistake of creating, for the wrong reasons back in the early 70s, it's just going to be very difficult to take advantage of some of those possibilities.
Thank you.
Secretary Shane, thank you again for being with us today. Please give my regards to Secretary Peters and your team there at DOT. And Tony, first, thank you for your help. You were helpful in briefing our staff and getting us ready for this. And please send my regards to our colleagues at Federal Highway Administration.
Thanks very much to the board.
I'd like to call forward our second panel this morning. We're pleased to have Mr. Matthew K. Rose from the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway Company, along with Mr. James R. Young from the Union Pacific Railroad Company. And I don't know if you two have drawn straws as to who would like to kick it off. I'll let you decide, and welcome. And it's a pleasure to have both of you here today. I think it's awfully important that we hear early today from the folks who own most of the network about what's going on and what we can expect to see in the future.
Morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You asked us to answer 4 questions. The first was, what level of capacity are we currently operating at? Second, how do we measure that capacity? Third is the quality of the infrastructure improving? And fourth is, how do we expand that capacity? And I'm going to answer all 4 of those questions for you, specifically related to BNSF. But before, I'd like to make a couple comments. I've been involved in the National Transportation Policy and Finance Commission that was created under the Safety Lou Bill. And I just want to give you a couple perspectives. As Commissioner Mulvey and Vice Chairman Buttrey mentioned about being at a transportation hearing yesterday, this commission has been meeting almost monthly for over a year. And a good portion of those we've been holding field hearings, going out to places such as Memphis, Tennessee, Los Angeles, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia. We've got commission hearings in Chicago and St. Paul coming up, Dallas. And I have to tell you, it's really just like what you're seeing today, a room packed full of people, all there to express concern and questions about the future of our U.S. transportation network on the highway, on the railroads. And while this commission is tasked with primarily focusing on the highway infrastructure freight bill, it's amazing, witness after witness, we very, very quickly get to an issue that's around freight mobility. And it's just so simple. Everybody realizes that the role of the railroad industry is not going to be able to maintain its current market share. It's really going to have to grow its market share. And I can tell you that across the board of all of our customers in all cities and all metropolitan regions, there really is a belief that more rail capacity can provide a lot of benefit to that. As I said in my testimony, I'm going to outline those questions. I also, though, want to make a couple points around national transportation policy and making the points to make sure that the incentives that for freight rail transportation are based on rational, economic, safety, security, and also environmental regulatory policies. Each of these, to varying degrees, will have a very much of an impact on the maintenance and the expansion of the railroad industry. I think we need to start with a little bit of background in terms of why you're feeling the amount of concern on rail capacity. And if we just go back in a 5-year period, which is a fairly recent period in the railroad industry, we've seen as the economy started to recover, Right in the middle of that, we were starting to peak out in terms of trade growth with China. We were seeing tremendous strain on the entire national transportation system in terms of reaching that capacity. If you think about it in terms of the freight rail industry, it's really taken us 25 years to reach the product of steady GDP growth for the railroad industry. Staggered reform and powerful macroeconomic forces such as globalization. This period also marks the initiation of increasing levels of investment in the railroad capacity, which, quite frankly, as you heard from the Secretary, must be sustained with adequate revenues for the foreseeable future. At BNSF, the infrastructure today is in better shape than it's ever been before, and that is based up with facts around lower accident rates and the ability for us to be able to handle reliably significant year-over-year volume increases. In short, BNSF is growing. We're investing to meet the volume forecasted demand. The classic business model is very much alive and well and working. We want to provide the services that our customers want, and we will with adequate returns, a rational public policy environment, and economic growth. I brought a couple of slides because sometimes a picture's worth 1,000 words. So with the first question of how do you measure capacity in the railroad industry? And many times this question is not adequately answered because it is a very difficult question to answer. The slide that you have, though, shows the density of this railroad network. And let me illustrate a little bit of the complexity of trying to define the capacity of a company like BNSF. We operate 32,000 miles of railroad in our overall network. The map shows the various line segments that you'll see everywhere from 100 trains a day on certain line segments down to 5 trains a day. So you can see that each piece of railroad is not created equally. Drilling down, there's really 5 areas that define capacity: volume, train density, elements of our physical plant, productivity, and finally, people. The first capacity driver is, of course, volume. The reason why we're having this conversation today about rail capacity is because of the significant volume increases within the rail industry. In the last 9 years, since 1996, the industry has grown more than 10 million units, or a 33% increase in growth. At BNSF, the same is true. Our volume has grown more than 52%, driven primarily by our consumer products. The second question is, how do we measure capacity? Here's a snapshot of a given subdivision on our railroad that shows the volume versus capacity. The shaded green area represents our average daily trains. The gray area represents our peak day trains. The red line is our capacity line. As train volumes approaches the capacity limit, we must plan for the future growth, as well as allow for adequate track maintenance time. The role of service design in our company is to plan capacity on the network in advance of the forecasted growth. The second capacity driver is train density. One of the tools we use is what's called a string line graph, which is what you're seeing here. The chart on the left is the subdivision with medium train density on our network. The chart on the right is a subdivision with heavy train density. These two graphs look complex, but the point that they really illustrate is very simple. To get more capacity on the network, you just can't add more trains. The third capacity driver includes element of the physical plant. We look at four key physical operating parameters: siding lengths, distance between sidings, grade, and slow orders. The point here is that people would be amazed at the level of technology within all these railroads that have the ability and utilizing of scientific tools to measure the capacity of the railroad industry. We also gain capacity by expanding our physical plant. Since 1996, on just our southern Transcon line between LA and Chicago, we've invested $1.1 billion on double track on this route. By 2008, this 2,200-mile route segment will be double track, creating the longest super rail highway in the United States. In fact, later this year, we'll begin triple tracking the transcontinental main line. The fourth driver of capacity is simply productivity, being able to get more capacity out of the existing network. Through initiatives such as increasing train length, units per train, revising intermodal storage policies, reshaping the carload network, BNSF's made great productivity increases, and quite frankly, we had to. Our customers can have helped us in this effort as well. For example, customers have invested nearly $2 billion in our grain shuttle facilities over the last 10 years, and we'll discuss the impact of that investment in a minute. The final driver of capacity is people. BNSF began hiring aggressively in 2001. The
The vast majority of our hiring at BNSF is really focused on the people that operate our trains, as well as maintain our tracks and provide the mechanical service for our equipment. Since 2001, we will have hired about 16,000 people to our railroad. We've taken a look also at how we get the most out of our existing capacity, but there becomes a point where we just need to increase the capacity, and there's a number of ways to do that. First, though, most importantly, we have to maintain the quality of the infrastructure. Simply having an adequate rate of return to make continual investments in maintaining that system is vitally critical. All we have to do is to look back to the early 1980s to see the quality of the infrastructure and the impact for our ability to move business on the railroad industry. The second way, as I mentioned, is to have better throughput. At BNSF, we refer to this as our velocity initiative. The third way to increase capacity is through safety regulations that embrace technology to improve capacity, such as our recent test of ECP brakes. Another great technological advancement is our electronic train system management, ETMS, which is the first approved automatic control system that will prevent train collisions and overspeed accidents. Train planning systems or movement planners is another way that we can increase capacity on the railroad system. This system will optimize over-the-road train operations based on train priorities, performance against schedules, and velocity. And the future big idea that's out there is in signal technology will be when we go to a moving block signal system. This will allow railroads to base train blocking distances on the actual stopping distances of each specific train versus the stopping distance of the train that takes the longest to stop as we currently do it. This will allow railroads to increase the number of trains on their network. The fourth way to increase capacity is by ensuring that local public policies are made on a federal basis. That question was asked a little bit earlier, and I have to tell you, one of the big threats to the national railroad system right now is local and states taking over the role of regulators. The final component of increasing capacity is expansion of the physical plant. Let's take just a minute and look at BNSF and look at how the volume's changed since 1996. We've grown from 7 million units to 10.6 million units last year. If you think about that growth in units, 3.6 million units, that would have equated to 3.6 million more truck moves on the nation's highway systems. When you convert that into truck miles, that would have accounted for 5.5 billion truck miles that would have gone on the nation's highways, and I think we can all assume that that would not have been a big idea. As we know, coal is a very important commodity within the railroads, and we've seen a tremendous growth in that coal tonnage as well over the last 10 years to more than 287 million tons per year. Coal tonnage since 96 has grown at a CAGR of 3.6%. To accommodate the growth in the coal business, BNSF's put more train sets in service and is making significant investments. We've invested $2.3 billion in coal alone since 1996. While not at the same pace, our industrial volumes have also grown over that same 10-year period. Our agricultural products volumes has grown at a compound annual rate of about 2% since 1996. The bulk of the growth occurred in the last 4 years. And ethanol is one of the reasons for the recent increase in our domestic ag business. There's been a lot of discussion about ethanol and the railroad's ability to handle the ethanol movement that's going on out there. And based on the improvements that we've seen as well as the investments, we are very confident we'll be able to handle the projected ethanol growth. We've also been able to handle this increased volume in ag because of our investments in the agricultural business unit. We continue to invest significantly in large-scale covered hoppers for the ag business, bringing in over 16,000 since 1996. For our ag business, though, one of the key lessons learned about productivity, it's not just about the rail cars, though, it's the productive use of those rail cars. The combination of the investments that I mentioned earlier from our customers and our velocity improvements has resulted in a huge increase in our capacity to handle more ag business. In addition to the operational design changes, commercial changes to our business have also had tremendous capacity implications. Several years ago, as you all know, we implemented our shuttle program as demanded by the farmers increasing productivity. We all know that shuttles allow much more productivity movements of ag products, not just whole grains. Our capacity investments and velocity improvements are the reasons why we ended 2006 with a few hundred past due orders compared to 22,000 past due orders in the year 2003. and I was here at that time, and it was not a pleasant period. On average, our days late in 2006 were 5 days late versus 20 days late in 2003. The big driver, though, of our growth has been the intermodal business. Double-digit increases in our international intermodal business are due to the increased U.S. trade with China. Our domestic intermodal business also continues to grow due to demand from our trucking partners and increases in long-haul trailer and container traffic, as well as growth in volume from one of our largest customers, UPS. Clearly, the way that we've coped with the volume increases is through velocity and capital expansion. Since 1996, BNSF has invested more than $8.2 billion in locomotives and expansion capacity. Let's look at a couple of those capacity expansions in just 2007. This year on the Southern Transcon, we'll double track or triple track about 30 miles. To provide some context, a couple of years ago, about 7 years ago when I was Chief Operating Officer for the BNSF, we operated about 60 trains per day. Now we're operating almost 100 trains a day due to that capital that's been put out there. On the coal route, we'll add about 60 miles of third and fourth main line in the Powder River Basin and complete about 50 miles of double track in Nebraska and Wyoming.